From the outside, Willow Creek Apartments seemed like the perfect place to live. A high-end residential complex with beautifully landscaped gardens, pristine hallways, and a quiet, orderly atmosphere. The tenants were mostly professionals, retired individuals, and families who enjoyed the suburban peace that the neighborhood promised. Everything about the place suggested harmony, security, and exclusivity. But for Michael Carter, a black man who had been living there for a year, the reality was far different. The unspoken rules of the community were clear. It wasn't meant for people like him. Though he paid the same high rent as everyone else, he often felt like an outsider. The stares from neighbors, the forced politeness in conversations, and the subtle yet undeniable microaggressions made it clear that his presence was tolerated, not welcomed. Yet nothing compared to the way Richard Evans, the landlord, treated him. At first, Michael had assumed that Richard's cold demeanor was simply part of his personality. He had been professional, though distant, when Michael signed the lease. But over time, the pattern became obvious. Richard treated Michael differently than his white tenants. For starters, Richard was notorious for making maintenance requests a nightmare for Michael. When his heater broke during the winter, Richard took 3 weeks to send a repairman. Yet when a white neighbor had a leaky sink, a plumber showed up the next morning. The excuse? "We're backed up with requests right now." At first, Michael brushed it off. Maybe it really was just bad timing. Maybe he was overthinking it. But then came the realization that his rent was significantly higher than his white neighbors for identical units. One afternoon, while chatting with a friendly elderly tenant named Mrs. Thompson, she casually mentioned that her rent had been the same for 5 years, hundreds of dollars less than what Michael was paying. It didn't take long for Michael to confirm the truth. Other black tenants he spoke to had noticed the same thing: higher rent, longer wait times for repairs, and dismissive attitudes from Richard whenever they voiced concerns. One man, who had lived in the building for 3 years, told Michael bluntly, "Richard doesn't want us here. He just makes it hard enough so we eventually leave on our own." But it wasn't just about money, it was about control. Michael began noticing a small security camera installed near his front door, something no other unit had. At first, he thought it was standard for security purposes, but then he realized none of his neighbors had them. Was Richard watching him? The feeling of being under surveillance was suffocating. Whenever he had visitors, Richard would coincidentally appear in the hallway, pretending to check something. One night, after his cousin left his apartment, Richard approached him and said, in a casual yet pointed tone, "I see you have company often. You know, some tenants don't like too much noise around here." There was no complaint, no actual reason for concern, just a warning, a reminder, a veiled threat that Michael's presence was always being monitored. As time went on, Michael realized that Richard was more than just an unfair landlord. He was a gatekeeper, ensuring that only a certain type of tenant felt comfortable in his building. And Michael was not that type. At first, Michael tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling that came with living in Willow Creek Apartments. He told himself that maybe he was overanalyzing things, that the differences in treatment were just coincidences. But as the months passed, the microaggressions became impossible to ignore, and the quiet hostility turned into blatant harassment. The first major incident happened when Michael submitted a formal maintenance request for his bathroom, which had a persistent mold issue. Richard, as expected, ignored it for weeks, despite Michael following up multiple times. Meanwhile, a white neighbor in the same building mentioned in passing how her request for a simple loose cabinet door had been handled within 2 days. Frustrated, Michael decided to escalate the situation by contacting the local tenants' rights office. The moment Richard received notice of the complaint, his attitude shifted from passive-aggressive to outright hostile. "I don't appreciate being reported over a minor issue," Richard snapped when he ran into Michael in the hallway one evening. "If you have a problem, maybe this isn't the right place for you." Michael could feel the threat underneath those words. Richard didn't like being challenged, and he certainly didn't like the idea of a black tenant standing up for himself. From that moment on, the landlord made it his mission to make Michael's stay as uncomfortable as possible. The next sign of escalation was a sudden baseless noise complaint. One morning, Michael received a formal notice from management stating that multiple tenants had complained about excessive noise coming from his apartment. The problem? He had been at work all day when the supposed disturbance happened. Confused, he asked around, but none of his neighbors seemed to know anything about it. Then came the mysterious violations. Richard began sending notices about small infractions, things no one else in the building seemed to be penalized for. A trash bag left outside his door for 5 minutes before taking it down. Violation. A visitor parking in the guest lot for too long. Violation. A small doormat outside his door, just like everyone else had. Violation. Michael was growing increasingly frustrated. It wasn't just about inconvenience anymore, it was about power. But the real tipping point came when Michael started noticing strange people hanging around his car in the parking lot. Late at night, he would see unfamiliar men loitering near his vehicle, inspecting it from different angles. One night, after work, he walked out to find that his tires had been slashed. When he reported it to Richard, the landlord barely looked concerned. "Maybe you shouldn't have such an expensive car in this neighborhood," Richard said with a smirk. That's when Michael knew this wasn't just about making him uncomfortable. Richard wanted him gone, but Michael had had enough. Instead of backing down, he decided to fight back. And this time, he wouldn't do it alone. Michael had endured enough. The constant harassment, the unfair treatment, and the clear attempt to push him out of Willow Creek Apartments had pushed him to his breaking point. But he refused to leave. This was his home, and he wasn't going to let a racist landlord force him out. Richard, however, wasn't done. When he realized that his usual tactics weren't working, that Michael wasn't just going to give up and move, he decided to take things to the next level. One evening, as Michael was returning from work, he noticed something unusual. The door to the apartment next to his had been left slightly open, and the hallway looked like someone had rummaged through the space in a hurry. Michael had seen his neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Brooks, earlier that morning, but something about the scene felt off. Had someone broken in? Not wanting to get involved in something that wasn't his business, Michael walked past the apartment and headed straight to his own door. Just as he was unlocking it, a voice rang out from the other end of the hall. "Hey, what are you doing over there?" Michael turned to see Richard storming toward him, phone in hand, an exaggerated look of outrage on his face. "I knew it. I knew something was going on with you," Richard shouted. Confused, Michael frowned. "What are you talking about?" Richard gestured dramatically toward the open apartment door. "Mr. Brooks's place. I just got a call from him saying someone broke in. And now here you are, sneaking around. I should have known." Before Michael could even process what was happening, Richard was already dialing 911. "Yes, I'd like to report a break-in," Richard said, his voice dripping with fake urgency. "A man is lurking outside my neighbor's apartment. He's black, tall, and wearing dark clothes. I think he's trying to run." Michael stood there, stunned. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a setup. Within minutes, sirens blared in the distance. Michael's heart pounded. He had seen how these situations played out before. He knew that the moment the cops arrived, his word wouldn't matter. He would be guilty until proven innocent, if he was lucky enough to even get that chance. The other tenants began peeking out of their doors, watching the scene unfold. Richard had a smug expression, as if he had finally won. When the police pulled up, officers jumped out of their vehicles, hands hovering over their weapons. "Hands up!" "Step away from the apartment," one officer ordered. Michael did as he was told, keeping his hands visible. "I live here," he said calmly. "I have nothing to do with this." Richard, ever the performer, put on his best victim act. "Officers, this man has been acting suspicious for weeks. He's always wandering the halls at odd hours. My tenants don't feel safe." Michael clenched his jaw. This was it. Richard was trying to paint him as a criminal. The officers moved toward Michael, their expressions unreadable. But then something unexpected happened. "That's not true." The voice came from Mr. Brooks himself, standing at the end of the hall with his cane, looking furious. "I didn't say someone broke in. I lost my keys and I called the landlord to let me in. But I never said anything about Michael." Richard froze. The officers hesitated. Then another voice spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson." "He's lying," she said, pointing at Richard. "He's been harassing Michael for months. You should be questioning him, not Michael." The tide was turning, and Richard knew it. But Michael wasn't done yet. "Officers," he said, voice steady, "I have proof that Richard has been targeting me for months, and I think you'll want to see it." Michael strikes back, uncovering the truth. Michael knew that words alone wouldn't be enough to prove Richard's pattern of harassment. The landlord had been careful, manipulating situations to his advantage and relying on the fact that no one would believe a black tenant over a respected white landlord. But this time, Michael was prepared. As the officers hesitated between Richard's accusations and the testimony of Mr. Brooks and Mrs. Thompson, Michael reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for his phone. "I recorded everything," he said, his voice calm but firm, "and I have even more proof than that." He tapped on his phone screen and pulled up a series of videos, emails, and documents that he had spent the past few weeks gathering. The first video was taken from a small camera Michael had secretly installed in his living room window, facing the hallway. It clearly showed Richard standing outside his door late at night, trying to peer inside. Another video captured a maintenance worker confessing that Richard had ordered him to delay fixing anything in Michael's apartment for as long as possible. The officers exchanged glances as Michael continued. "And this isn't just about me," he said, scrolling through a spreadsheet of rent prices from public records. It showed a clear pattern. Black tenants were being charged hundreds of dollars more than white tenants in the same building. He turned the phone toward the officers. "Richard isn't just a bad landlord, he's a criminal. Overcharging tenants based on race is illegal, and so is using the police to harass someone with false accusations." Richard's face turned pale. He opened his mouth to argue, but the evidence spoke for itself. The officer in charge sighed and turned toward the landlord. "Mr. Evans, I think we need to have a longer conversation down at the station," the officer said. Richard immediately switched tactics. Wait, he stammered. "This is all a misunderstanding. He's twisting things. I was just trying to protect my tenants." But Michael wasn't done yet. "I also found something else," he said, pulling out a printed newspaper article from years ago. It was an old, yellowed clipping featuring a younger Richard at a protest, a white supremacist rally. Murmurs spread through the small crowd of tenants who had gathered in the hallway. The truth was out. Richard's attempt to cover his tracks had failed spectacularly. The same system he had tried to use against Michael was now turning against him. One of the officers walked toward Richard, pulling out his handcuffs. "Mr. Evans, you're under arrest for filing a false police report, discrimination in housing practices, and harassment," the officer announced. As the cuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, Michael finally let out a slow breath. Justice was finally being served. But he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was standing up for every person who had ever been targeted, profiled, and pushed out of their homes just because of their race. And this was only the beginning. As Richard Evans was led away in handcuffs, a stunned silence filled the hallway of Willow Creek Apartments. Tenants who had watched him rule over the building with unchecked power for years now saw him for what he truly was: a manipulator, a racist, and a fraud. Michael had done what no one else had dared to do. He had exposed Richard's corruption and forced the system to hold him accountable. But the fight wasn't over yet. The arrest made headlines in the local news. "Landlord arrested for housing discrimination and false police report," one article read. Another piece detailed how Michael's evidence had prompted an official investigation into Richard's property management practices, revealing years of illegal activity. The report showed that Richard had systematically charged Black and Latino tenants higher rent, delayed their maintenance requests, and even tried to force some out by fabricating violations, all while protecting his wealthier white tenants. The case was gaining traction fast. Michael's lawyer filed a civil lawsuit against Richard and his management company for racial discrimination and harassment. More former tenants began coming forward with their own stories of mistreatment under Richard's rule. Some had been wrongfully evicted, others had been subjected to unfair fines and fees, and many had simply left after realizing they were fighting a losing battle. But now things had changed. With mounting pressure from activists, lawyers, and journalists, the city's housing department launched a full-scale investigation into all properties owned by Richard Evans. What they found was shocking: dozens of complaints, hidden violations, and financial fraud. It wasn't just racism, it was systemic abuse that had gone unchecked for years. Meanwhile, back at Willow Creek Apartments, Tenants started seeing immediate changes. The property management company, now desperate to repair their public image, fired Richard permanently and hired a new administrator. Maintenance requests that had been ignored for months were suddenly being addressed. For the first time, the tenants, especially those who had been mistreated, felt like they had a voice. As for Michael, his courage had earned him more than just personal justice. He had become a symbol of resistance against discrimination in housing. Community leaders reached out to him, encouraging him to join efforts to change policies that allowed landlords like Richard to operate unchecked. One evening, as Michael stepped out of his apartment, he noticed something different. For the first time since moving in, his neighbors greeted him not with forced politeness, but with genuine respect. Mrs. Thompson walked up to him, a grateful smile on her face. "You didn't just fight for yourself," she said. "You fought for all of us." Michael smiled, taking a deep breath. He had come to Willow Creek Apartments as just another tenant, but now he had changed the community for the better. Richard had tried to use the system to get rid of him, but instead, Michael had used the truth to bring him down. And in the end, justice had finally been served. With Richard Evans behind bars and the truth exposed, Willow Creek Apartments was no longer the same place it once was. The building, once ruled by fear and silent discrimination, was now undergoing a transformation. The voices that had once been ignored were finally being heard. The new property manager wasted no time making changes. Maintenance requests that had sat unresolved for months were now being completed within days. The hidden security cameras that Richard had installed outside specific apartments were taken down. The unfair fees and penalties imposed on Black and Latino tenants were overturned, and those who had been wrongfully evicted were given legal assistance to seek justice. But perhaps the biggest change was in the attitude of the tenants themselves. For years, many had chosen to stay silent, either out of fear or ignorance, pretending not to notice the injustices happening around them. But after seeing what Michael had gone through and how he had fought back, they began to understand something important. Staying silent made them complicit. Now, instead of avoiding tough conversations, neighbors started standing up for one another. A tenant committee was formed to hold the new management accountable and to ensure that no one else would ever experience what Michael had endured. People who had once turned a blind eye were now actively working to create a fairer, more inclusive community. As for Michael, his life had changed in ways he never expected. His battle against Richard had turned him into a local hero, and activists fighting against housing discrimination reached out to him, encouraging him to use his experience to bring about greater change. One evening, he found himself speaking at a community meeting about tenant rights. The room was filled with people who had experienced similar struggles. People who had been priced out of their homes, targeted by unfair landlords, and silenced by an unjust system. Michael shared his story, not just to talk about what he had been through, but to show others that they too could fight back. "We're stronger when we stand together," he said, looking out at the crowd. "I was just one person. But when the truth came out, it wasn't just my fight anymore, it became our fight. And we won." The applause was thunderous, but Michael knew this was just the beginning. A few weeks later, as he walked through the building that had once felt suffocating, he noticed a new sense of unity among the tenants. People who had once ignored each other now greeted one another warmly. Neighbors who had once stayed out of each other's business were now looking out for one another. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly tenant who had spoken up in his defense, waved him over. "I never thought I'd see the day," she said, smiling. "This place finally feels like home." Michael looked around and nodded. It wasn't just about winning against Richard anymore. It was about reclaiming a community that had been divided for too long. As he stood there, he realized something powerful. This wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced, mistreated, or forced to live in fear. And that, more than anything else, was the greatest justice of all.